The neon sign of Maggie's diner flickered against the quiet highway as Emma Gray wiped down the counter for the 10th time, trying to distract herself from the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine, a feeling she had learned to trust ever since her husband, Navy SEAL Jonathan Reaper Gray, drilled into her that instincts were a survival tool, not paranoia. But tonight, something about the three boys sitting in the corner booth, Kyle, Ryder, and Mason, felt wrong from the moment they swaggered in. With that bored, dangerous confidence that belonged to people who had never truly been challenged in life, bullies who were used to townspeople looking away, people who had no idea that the woman pouring their coffee had spent years living with a man whose entire existence was built on discipline, strength, and a quiet kind of deadly awareness. Still, Emma kept her smile soft as she delivered their order, ignoring the way Ryder's eyes lingered too long, ignoring the crude whisper Mason let slip. Reminding herself that Jonathan was deployed and she couldn't afford trouble, but the moment Kyle stuck his foot out and deliberately tripped her, sending hot coffee spilling onto the floor and pain jolting up her wrist, she snapped a warning look at them, calm, steady, unafraid, and that triggered something inside the boys, a bruise to their egos, because bullies couldn't handle defiance, they needed submission, they needed someone to make small so they could feel tall, and the moment Emma told them to leave if they couldn't behave, their expression shifted from entertained to offended, then to something darker. Closing time came fast, the diner empty except for the sound of Emma locking up, unaware that the trio had circled around the back, waiting, whispering about teaching the waitress a lesson, their breath fogging in the cold air as they grabbed her the moment she stepped outside. She fought harder than they expected, remembering every hold Jonathan had taught her, but 3 against 1 wasn't a fight, it was an ambush, and despite her kicks, her elbows, her screams muffled by Ryder's hand, they dragged her across the gravel lot toward the old oak tree beside the flickering sign, tying her wrists with rope stolen from the shed, mocking her, laughing as she struggled, the fear rising not because of what they were doing, but because she knew men like this escalated. The cold wind bit at her cheeks as they circled her, threatening her, shoving her, recording clips on their phones for attention, for likes, for cruelty, all while she tried to steady her breath, reminding herself that she wasn't alone, not truly, because she remembered Jonathan's words, if you're ever in trouble, Kim, you call me. Doesn't matter where I am. Doesn't matter what I'm doing. I will come. And with trembling fingers, while the boys argued over what humiliation to film next, she managed to pull her phone from her apron pocket, dialing Jonathan with a swipe she prayed didn't fail, and when the call connected, she didn't even speak, she didn't have to, because all he heard was her terrified breathing, the wind, and the cruel laughter in the background, and Jonathan, thousands of miles away but instantly alert, didn't ask questions, didn't waste breath on panic, he simply said in a voice cold enough to stop hearts, Emma, hold on. I'm coming. The line disconnected, but those words wrapped around her like armor, and even as Kyle noticed the phone and smashed it on the ground, even as the boys tied her tighter, even as they argued about what to do next, Emma stopped shaking, because she knew every mile between them had just become a battlefield, and Jonathan Gray was already on his way, and God help the boys who thought tying a waitress to a tree would end as a joke, unaware that they had just declared war on a Navy SEAL who had never once lost a fight. And as the cold night deepened, and the bullies' laughter echoed through the empty lot, Emma closed her eyes, feeling not fear, but the distant, rising storm of a man who lived for moments just like this, a storm the bullies would never be ready for. The moment Jonathan Reaper Gray heard Emma's breathing choke through the phone, every inch of him shifted from calm to combat mode, a transformation as natural as breathing for a Navy SEAL who had survived deserts, jungles, and war zones most men couldn't even imagine. In seconds, he had already pinpointed variables, distance, weather, tactical routes, nearest airfield, because Emma's silence told him everything he needed to know, and the laughter in the background, the taunting voices, the way the wind cut through the receiver told him it wasn't a break-in or a fall or an accident, it was men, boys, cowards who had just crossed a line they didn't understand existed. Jonathan didn't waste time with emotion, didn't let panic cloud him, he moved, grabbing his emergency duffel, the one he kept packed with civilian and tactical essentials, the one Emma used to playfully call his paranoid bag, but tonight it was the reason he didn't lose minutes he couldn't afford. He sprinted to the base duty officer's office, his voice sharp with urgency but controlled with authority, explaining only what was necessary: family emergency. Immediate leave required. And because Jonathan had a reputation for saving lives, for completing missions nobody else wanted, for stepping into fire and walking out untouched, the officer approved his emergency extraction instantly. 30 minutes later, he was aboard a military transport jet rerouted for him, strapped in, silent, eyes closed but every muscle coiled with fury, replaying Emma's breathing, memorizing each sound like coordinates, like a map leading him back to her. He didn't know who touched her, but he knew exactly what he would do when he found out, because Jonathan Gray had one sacred rule: nobody harms my wife. And meanwhile, back at the diner, the bullies paced around Emma like hyenas circling a lioness, still mocking her, still believing they were the apex predators tonight. Mason kept shining his phone flashlight on her face, recording her tears, while Ryder tugged at her hair, telling her that being a pretty little waitress won't help now. But Emma, shaking, bruised, cold, felt a strange calm settling over her chest, because Jonathan's voice had flipped a switch inside her, reminding her that the person coming for her was not a regular man, not a boyfriend who'd show up crying or panicking, but a soldier forged in the kind of darkness these boys couldn't survive 5 seconds in. And as the boys argued about what to do next, leave her here, scare her more, or rough her up to make her learn, news traveled fast in small towns, and their loud taunts had already caught the attention of an elderly trucker resting near the pumps. who squinted through the dim light and recognized Emma tied to the tree, his heart stumbling with shock as he reached for his cell phone to dial the sheriff. But before he could move, Kyle noticed him and threatened him with a crowbar, forcing the old man to speed off, his truck engine roaring into the night. Hoping he could reach help before things escalated, the boys laughed again, convinced they were untouchable, fearless in their stupid bravado, unaware that every second ticking by was another second closer to judgment, because Jonathan's flight touched ground in record time, the pilot understanding the urgency without needing details, and as the hatch opened, Jonathan didn't wait for protocol, he jumped out, boots hitting the tarmac, grabbing the keys to the government-issued SUV already arranged for him, his eyes burning with a purpose so fierce even the MP on duty stepped aside. He floored the accelerator, the engine screaming as the miles vanished under his tires, his mind running through scenarios: Emma injured, Emma unconscious, Emma fighting, and with each possibility, his jaw tightened until his teeth ached, his hands gripping the wheel like he could break it. He called the sheriff's department on the in-car radio, providing his ID, his clearance, demanding immediate dispatch to Maggie's diner, and the sheriff, a man who had known Jonathan since high school, didn't hesitate, ordering all units to converge on the diner. Sirens already slicing through the countryside, but Jonathan knew the police were backup, not rescue. Because he wasn't waiting for anyone to save his wife for him. Meanwhile, Emma's wrists bled against the ropes, every tug sending a spike of pain up her arms, but she refused to give the boys the satisfaction of seeing her break, and when Ryder slapped her across the face, she stared him down with a strength that confused him, a strength that made him step back like she wasn't the victim he thought she was, and he muttered, "Why are you smiling?" Because yes, Emma was smiling now, barely. Faintly, but undeniably, she swallowed the metallic taste of blood and whispered, voice ragged but unwavering, "Because he's coming." That sentence hit the trio with a confusion they laughed off, but something about the way she said it, calm, certain, seeded the tiniest thread of unease in Kyle's chest, and miles away, headlights carved through the darkness as Jonathan's SUV tore down the highway like a predator locked onto prey, his heart pounding not with fear but with wrath, a firestorm building inside him that would not stop until Emma was safe in his arms and the men who touched her were on the ground begging for mercy. He didn't intend to give. The storm was coming fast, faster than anyone realized, and as the diner's neon sign flickered in the distance, Emma opened her eyes to the sound of distant engines, her breath catching, her heart lifting, because she knew what was coming. The monsters who thought they owned the night were about to meet the man who did. The night split open when Jonathan's SUV screeched into the gravel lot outside Maggie's diner, headlights cutting through the dark like blades as dust swirled violently behind him, and before the engine even finished growling to a stop he was already out of the vehicle, boots hitting the ground with the quiet precision of a man trained to eliminate threats before they even understood they were in danger. And the moment he saw Emma tied to the oak tree, her arms raw and trembling, her hair tangled, her cheek bruised, her breath sharp and uneven, his entire world narrowed into a single pulse of rage so potent it felt like the earth shifted beneath him. But he didn't scream, didn't rush blindly, didn't do anything emotional, because Jonathan Gray was a Navy SEAL, and SEALs didn't let fury control them, they sharpened it into a weapon. Kyle, Ryder, and Mason froze mid-laugh the second they noticed him, confusion twisting into panic as they registered the look in his eyes, not the wild anger of a civilian, but the cold, calculated stillness of a soldier who had killed before and would not hesitate to do it again if necessary. "Who the hell are you?" Kyle barked, lifting the crowbar like it could save him, but Jonathan didn't even look at the weapon, his gaze locked only on Emma, his voice low, steady, terrifying as he said, "Emma, I'm here," and she exhaled a single, broken sob of relief that fueled him with even more purpose. He took one step forward, shoulders squared, posture lethal, and the boys instinctively backed up because the aura pouring off him wasn't just intimidation, it was battlefield dominance, the kind that made grown men drop rifles and surrender. "Stay back," Ryder stammered, pulling out a pocket knife with hands that suddenly weren't so steady, but Jonathan merely tilted his head, analyzing their positions, their stances, their breathing patterns, calculating faster than any of them could think. Then, in one blur of motion, he moved, closing the distance before Kyle could blink, grabbing the crowbar mid-swing, twisting it out of his hands with such brutal force that Kyle's wrist cracked, sending him screaming to the ground. Mason lunged next, panic overriding logic, swinging wildly, but Jonathan ducked under the blow, slammed an elbow into his ribs, grabbed his collar, and drove him into the dirt so hard the air exploded out of his lungs in a pathetic wheeze. Ryder, shaking, knife trembling, tried to back away, muttering, "We weren't gonna really hurt her, man, we were just..." But Jonathan cut him off with nothing but a look so cold it drained the blood from Ryder's face. "You tied my wife to a tree," Jonathan said quietly, stepping forward like a shadow swallowing light. "You hurt her, you touched her, and you think you're walking away tonight?" Ryder swung the knife in fear, a sloppy, desperate arc, but Jonathan sidestepped effortlessly, grabbed Ryder's wrist, and twisted until the knife clattered to the ground, then pinned him to the dirt with a knee to the spine as Ryder screamed for help that was never coming. The sheriff's sirens were already echoing in the distance, growing louder, but Jonathan ignored them, his hands finally moving to Emma as he cut through the ropes with Ryder's dropped knife, catching her before she fell, pulling her into his chest with a gentleness that contrasted violently with the destruction behind him. Emma clung to him, shaking, whispering, "You came, you really came," and Jonathan pressed his forehead to hers, voice dropping to a soft, trembling whisper only she could hear, "I will always come for you." But behind them, Kyle groaned and tried to crawl away, prompting Jonathan to turn his head slowly, his eyes switching from tenderness to deadly promise in a heartbeat. He stood, lifting Emma protectively behind him as he walked toward Kyle, who whimpered, "Please, please man, don't," but Jonathan crouched beside him, speaking with icy clarity, "You're not afraid of me, you're afraid of the consequences," and then he leaned in closer, deadly calm, "And you should be, because this wasn't just assault, this was kidnapping, torture, and the attempted terrorizing of a woman who belonged to a man who lived in a world where consequences were measured in broken bones and shattered pride." The sheriff cars finally flooded the lot, lights flashing red and blue as officers jumped out shouting commands, but they slowed when they saw Jonathan, recognizing him instantly, understanding that whatever chaos occurred here was justified. The sheriff jogged over, breathless, asking, "Jonathan, what the hell happened?" And Jonathan simply turned, stepping aside so Emma was fully visible, tide marks still burning on her wrists, her cheek bruised, her eyes swollen, and the sheriff's face turned stormy with outrage as he barked orders for the boys to be cuffed, dragged to their feet, screaming protests that nobody listened to, and as Emma leaned into Jonathan's side, exhausted and trembling but finally safe, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, whispering, "You're safe now, Em. They'll never touch you again," and as the bullies were shoved into patrol cars, the sheriff turned back to Jonathan and murmured, "Good thing you got here first, because I don't think anyone else could have stopped this," and Jonathan looked down at his wife, brushing her hair from her face with a tenderness that made Emma's eyes well with tears again, whispering, "I'm not done, not until you're home," and in that moment, in the flashing lights and swirling dust, the bullies finally realized the truth. They had not just picked on a waitress, they had declared war on a Navy SEAL, and they had lost before the fight even began. As the sheriff's cruisers pulled away with the bullies screaming empty threats from the back seats, Jonathan kept one steady arm around Emma, guiding her slowly toward the SUV with a gentleness so controlled it almost contradicted the storm still raging inside him. Every time his eyes landed on the marks around her wrists, his jaw tightened until his teeth ached, because though the danger was contained, his mind replayed every second she had been tied to that tree, every tear, every breath, every bruise, and the thought of it twisted inside him like a knife. Emma leaned into him, exhaustion turning her steps shaky, and though she tried to stay strong, tried to keep the brave composure she held during the attack, her voice cracked when she whispered, I thought I was going to die, John," and those words shattered him in a way gunfire never had, because he had heard soldiers scream, he had heard enemies beg, but hearing fear in the voice of the woman he loved felt like failure, like guilt, like a wound deeper than any bullet could make. Jonathan stopped walking, turned gently to face her, cupping her face with steady hands, his thumb brushing away the tear sliding down her cheek as he said, voice breaking at the edges, "You survived. You fought. You held on long enough for me to get here, and I swear to God, Emma, I will never let anything like this touch you again." But Emma shook her head, not in disagreement, but in fragile disbelief, whispering, They enjoyed hurting me," and that sentence ignited something in Jonathan that felt almost inhuman, a fury so sharp his vision blurred for a moment, and he had to close his eyes, inhale, exhale, forcing himself to stay present, to stay grounded, because right now Emma needed a husband. Not the weapon the Navy had made him into. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, feeling her trembling against him as he whispered, "You're safe now, Em. They'll spend years behind bars for what they did," but deep inside he knew he was lying to himself. Those boys weren't hardened criminals, they were privileged kids with lawyers, families with influence, and a justice system that often softened for young offenders, and sure enough, as the sheriff returned with a grim expression, he confirmed Jonathan's fear, saying quietly, "I'm doing everything I can, John, but their parents are already calling lawyers. They'll try to paint this as a prank gone wrong." Jonathan's eyes went dead still, a predator's stare, and the sheriff lifted a hand quickly, adding, "I said they'll try, not that they'll win. We've got the rope, the knife, the recordings on their phones. We have enough to bury them legally if we move fast." Emma, exhausted, leaned into Jonathan's chest as he held her tight, whispering, "I don't want them to walk free. I can't live knowing they could find me again," and Jonathan turned to the sheriff with a voice as cold as steel, "If the law fails, I won't." The sheriff didn't dare argue because he knew Jonathan meant it, knew that the man standing before him had seen enough darkness to know how to operate outside the rules if pushed, but the sheriff also knew justice had a chance if handled carefully, so he urged Jonathan to take Emma home, get her out of the cold, get her cleaned up, get her resting, while he drafted official statements and started paperwork for multiple felonies. Jonathan nodded reluctantly, guiding Emma into the SUV, buckling her in like she was made of glass, checking her injuries with a tenderness that contrasted brutally with the violence he was still capable of, then driving slowly, very slowly, toward their cabin deep in the woods where the world was quiet, safe, untouched by cruelty. The gravel road hummed beneath the tires, but the silence between them was heavier, filled with everything Emma didn't want to relive and everything Jonathan wished he could erase. Halfway home, she whispered, "John, what if they get out? What if they come for me again?" And Jonathan reached over, taking her hand, squeezing it firmly as he murmured, "Emma, listen to me, nobody on this planet gets a second chance to hurt you. Not while I'm alive." His voice was so calm, so steady, so chillingly certain that Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear, but of safety, of knowing the man beside her wasn't just promising protection, he was protection. When they finally reached the cabin, Jonathan carried her inside despite her soft protests, setting her gently onto the couch, fetching warm water, bandages, and a blanket, tending to her wounds with hands that had inflicted pain on enemies thousands of miles away, yet trembled now as They treated the woman he loved. Emma's eyes softened as she watched him, whispering, "You're shaking?" And Jonathan froze for a moment, then admitted quietly, "Because I almost lost you." A confession so raw Emma felt tears rising again, but these tears weren't from fear, they were from love, from gratitude, from realizing how deeply Jonathan's world revolved around her. She reached up, cupping his cheek, whispering, "You didn't lose me. You saved me," and Jonathan leaned into her hand, eyes closing, his voice low, "I always will." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, a reminder of the same lonely night where she almost died, but inside the cabin, wrapped in Jonathan's arms, Emma finally felt the fear draining from her body, replaced with something stronger, hope, safety, the unbreakable certainty that no matter how dark the world became, she would never face it alone, and yet, even as she drifted toward sleep, held securely in Jonathan's embrace, neither of them knew that the Bullies' families were already plotting. Already pulling strings, already sowing seeds of corruption to twist the story in their favor, sparking a war Jonathan Gray was fully prepared to finish.